It's the year 12 AD, and you find yourself walking through the heart of the Roman Empire, Rome. The city is bustling, full of traders, soldiers, and the famous Roman hustle. The empire is expanding, its streets alive with the promise of power and greatness, and at its centre the Emperor Augustus, Rome's first emperor, holds the reins. But like all things in Rome, change is inevitable, and this will soon become a pivotal moment in history. Enter Caligula, born Gaius Julius Caesar, Augustus Germanicus, the young son of the beloved general Germanicus and his wife, Agrippina the Elder. Germanicus was adored by the people, and as the son of Emperor Augustus's family, Caligula's destiny seemed clear. He would become the future ruler of Rome, but fate, as it often does in the treacherous halls of Roman power, was a cruel master. At the age of 7, young Gaius watched as his father Germanicus died under suspicious circumstances, likely poisoned by Emperor Tiberius, Augustus's adopted son and heir. Caligula's life would never be the same. The death of his father left him scarred, and the young boy was thrust into the unpredictable world of the imperial court, surrounded by rivals, intrigue, and treachery. For years he lived under the oppressive shadow of Tiberius, who ruled with suspicion and paranoia. Tiberius, the reigning emperor, took Caligula in, not out of affection, but out of necessity. To Tiberius, Caligula was just another piece on the board, a potential heir to maintain control of the throne. But even as a child, Caligula saw the cruelty of Tiberius's reign. The emperor was known for his purges, exile of political enemies, and the ever-present danger of being labelled a traitor for the smallest offence. It was a world ruled by fear, and it shaped the young Caligula's character in ways that would later define his rule. Despite these hardships, Caligula was not one to be crushed by the weight of the imperial palace. He was charismatic, a skilled orator, and demonstrated an intellectual sharpness that stood out. His charm and wit would soon make him popular, not only among the elite, but also with the Roman populace. But even in these moments of relative calm, the Roman Empire's undercurrent of corruption and brutality seeped into his very soul. By the time Tiberius died in AD 37, Caligula was 24 years old, and the throne was his for the taking. The people of Rome cheered at the announcement. After the brutal, paranoid rule of Tiberius, they saw in Caligula the promise of a new era, one filled with celebration, reform, and hope. His first few months on the throne were filled with grandeur, banquets, and games. Caligula seemed to embrace the role of the people's emperor. He even reversed some of Tiberius's harsh policies, bringing exiles back to Rome and granting amnesty to those who had been wrongfully accused of treason. For a brief time, it seemed as though the promises of Caligula's reign would be fulfilled. The streets of Rome were filled with the sounds of laughter, and the empire seemed to breathe easier under the young emperor's rule. The people cheered as he threw lavish games in the Circus Maximus and constructed monumental buildings and structures throughout the city. Caligula's early reign, marked by his immense popularity, was the stuff of legend, but as anyone in Rome would tell you, the seeds of greatness, or madness, are often sown in the strangest of places. Behind the scenes, something was beginning to change in Caligula. Slowly but surely the young emperor began to reveal his darker side. His behaviour, once a picture of youthful exuberance, began to shift toward erratic and unpredictable. The first signs of this were seen in Caligula's treatment of the Senate. At first, he tried to work with them, allowing the Senate to retain some semblance of power. But over time, his paranoia grew, and he saw them as potential threats to his authority. Senators who opposed or even questioned him found themselves accused of treason, and some were executed without trial. Others were sent into exile or stripped of their wealth and titles. But it wasn't just political enemies who had to fear Caligula's wrath. He began to surround himself with a circle of loyal sycophants, men and women who would do anything to keep their emperor pleased. At first, it seemed as though his inner circle consisted of trusted advisors. However, this soon evolved into a frightening display of Caligula's control over those around him. He would have people executed for the slightest of insults or disagreements, and even his family wasn't safe from his growing suspicion. The first true indication of his madness came when Caligula fell seriously ill in the early part of AD 37. Some say that his illness, rumoured to have been a fever that nearly killed him, was the breaking point. After his recovery, Caligula emerged from the sickness a changed man. His temperament, once charming and playful, became erratic and violent. His paranoia deepened, and his desire to control everything around him grew. He no longer trusted anyone. His love for luxury and excess became insatiable. He began to lavish himself with treasures, and his demands for recognition grew to godlike proportions. The emperor began to make grandiose claims of divine status. He ordered temples built in his honor and commanded that people worship him as a living god. His arrogance became legendary. He wasn't content with being the ruler of Rome. He wanted to be worshipped as a deity, just as the gods themselves were. Statues of him were placed in sacred temples, and Caligula made sure to remind everyone that he was not just a ruler. He was a divine being above mortal men. His eccentricity only seemed to grow. He declared himself a living god, insisted on being worshipped by the Roman people, and gave extravagant gifts to those who followed his commands. The extravagant, almost theatrical nature of his behavior began to alienate many. Caligula's reign, once seen as a new hope for Rome, now seemed like a dangerous spectacle. It's now AD 38, and the air in Rome is thick with tension. The once promising reign of Emperor Caligula, which began with celebrations and hope, is quickly unraveling. What had been perceived as youthful exuberance and charm now reveals itself to be something darker. The man who seemed to promise a new era for Rome is becoming a tyrant, a ruler consumed by paranoia, cruelty, and a hunger for power that knows no bounds. As Caligula's behavior becomes more erratic, the people of Rome begin to fear their emperor rather than worship him. The Senate, already stripped of much of its power, finds itself in constant danger. What was once the most prestigious political body in the empire is now little more than a shadow of its former self, caught in the web of Caligula's unpredictability. The first true signs of Caligula's descent into madness appear in the way he treats those closest to him. While his early reign was marked by a level of cooperation with the Senate and other officials, by now that cooperation has completely evaporated. Caligula has become distrustful of anyone with power, viewing them as a threat to his absolute rule. Even his family members, who once seemed to be his allies, are not spared from his growing suspicion. Caligula's cousin, Tiberius Gemellus, is executed on the emperor's orders, despite having been named as a potential successor. No explanation is given for his death, but it's clear that Caligula, in his increasingly paranoid state, saw anyone with a claim to the throne as a potential rival. The cruelty doesn't stop with his family either. Senators, who had once been his supporters, are either killed or exiled on charges of treason. Caligula doesn't hesitate to eliminate anyone he sees as a threat, no matter their rank or status. One of the most infamous and chilling acts of his reign comes when Caligula orders the execution of his own close allies. One of these is his former ally and closest confidant, the Praetorian prefect Macro. The man who'd helped Caligula secure the throne is suddenly put to death, supposedly because Caligula suspected that Macro might be plotting against him. The brutality with which Caligula wipes out even his closest supporters shows just how deep his paranoia has taken root. It's clear now that Caligula's reign is no longer about governance or the good of Rome. It's about control, absolute control over every aspect of Roman life. To Caligula there are no friends, only subjects. And when he begins to view the Senate, his family, and even his loyal guards as potential threats, his grip on power tightens, leaving the empire in a state of constant fear. But the madness doesn't stop at purges and executions. Caligula begins to indulge in some of the most bizarre and infamous acts in Roman history. At first, these acts seem like eccentricities, a ruler doing things for spectacle or amusement. But as they grow in frequency and absurdity, they begin to take on a far darker tone. One of the most infamous aspects of Caligula's rule is his decision to appoint his favourite horse, Incitatus, as a priest. But the horse's rise doesn't stop there. Caligula is said to have planned to make Incitatus a consul, one of the highest political offices in the empire. This wasn't a token gesture. It was an outright mockery of the Roman political system and the Senate itself. Caligula's actions were meant to demonstrate his absolute power and to show the Senate just how little he cared for their authority. A horse was to be elevated to the highest political office, while the Senate itself was left impotent, unable to stop the madness. Many historians believe that this was less about genuine devotion to his horse and more about Caligula's desire to humiliate the Senate, reminding them that their position was ultimately meaningless in his eyes. Some ancient sources even claim that Caligula planned to have the horse dine with him at lavish banquets, further blurring the lines between absurdity and tyranny. To Caligula, it didn't matter if his actions were seen as insane. What mattered was that he could get away with them. While many of these stories sound like they belong in the realm of myth or legend, there are multiple accounts that corroborate these bizarre behaviours. The appointment of Incitatus is one of the most lasting and infamous examples of Caligula's disregard for the norms and traditions of Roman governance. It is perhaps the clearest indication that this was no longer a ruler trying to lead an empire, but a man lost in the delusions of his own power. But what happens when an emperor, one who once seemed destined for greatness, starts to lose touch with reality? What happens when a ruler stops caring about the people and begins to see himself as a god? For Caligula, the answer is simple: chaos. And chaos, as Rome would soon learn, is a dangerous thing. As Caligula's delusions grow more elaborate, so does his need for affirmation. He begins to demand divine honours. Not content to simply be the ruler of Rome, he declares himself a god. Statues of Caligula are erected throughout the empire and temples are dedicated to his worship. His demand for reverence grows to the point where it becomes impossible to ignore. He isn't just an emperor, he is the embodiment of Rome itself, a living god to be worshipped and adored by all. This growing sense of self-importance comes with disturbing consequences. Caligula's behaviour toward his family becomes increasingly bizarre, and he begins to make claims about his relationships with them that cause shockwaves throughout Rome. His sister, Julia Livilla, is rumoured to have been subjected to his inappropriate advances, though the veracity of these claims remains in dispute. However, Caligula's open indulgence in his own desires, regardless of the moral or legal consequences, becomes a public spectacle. At this point, the once celebrated emperor who had been greeted with cheers and joy is now met with fear and confusion. His reign, which had started with the hope of ending Tiberius's brutal legacy, now stands as an example of how absolute power can corrupt absolutely. By AD 39, the world that Caligula inherited from Tiberius has been thoroughly transformed, but not in the way the people of Rome had hoped. Once a ruler who promised prosperity, celebration, and a new era for the empire, Caligula has become something darker, more unpredictable, and infinitely more terrifying. His actions have escalated beyond the bizarre. Now, they verge on pure tyranny. As his reign progresses, Caligula's cruelty knows no bounds. Those who once celebrated his ascension to the throne now find themselves at the mercy of an emperor who is not just seeking power, but absolute dominance over everything and everyone. His paranoia grows so intense that even the slightest disagreement is grounds for execution. What began as a shift in temperament now fully blossoms into a reign of terror, leaving the Roman Senate, the political elite, and the very citizens of Rome trembling in fear. The first real victims of Caligula's tyranny are those closest to him: friends, allies, and even family members, once the emperor's most trusted, and once the ones who helped him rise to power, are now suspects in his eyes. Caligula's need for control reaches terrifying heights. His cousin, Tiberius Gemellus, a potential rival, is executed without warning. The execution is a cold reminder of the emperor's absolute power, and it sets the tone for the next few years. It doesn't matter if you're family or a loyal supporter. If Caligula sees you as a threat, you'll be removed regardless of the cost. The Senate, which had once held significant power in Roman governance, becomes a symbol of impotence under Caligula. No longer does the emperor engage with them as an equal, or even a political partner. Instead, he isolates them, undermining their authority and executing anyone who dares to challenge him. Senators found guilty of minor infractions or even whispered rumours of conspiracy are dragged through the streets, thrown into the dungeons, or in some cases executed without trial. As the body count rises, it becomes clear that Caligula's reign is defined by terror, not justice. His closest officials, once regarded as his confidants, quickly fall out of favour. People who had once helped solidify Caligula's position as emperor now find themselves facing brutal purges. His relationship with the Praetorian Guard, who had aided his rise to power, becomes equally fraught. They too are seen as potential threats to his absolute rule. Caligula orders the execution of Macro, the Praetorian prefect who had supported him during Tiberius's reign, and who had helped Caligula secure the throne. It's a brutal, shocking move, but not one that surprises anyone anymore. In Caligula's eyes, no one is above suspicion, not even those who had helped him rise. But Caligula's cruelty isn't confined to executions and purges. His reign quickly devolves into an era of grotesque indulgence. His love for luxury and excess grows insatiable. He throws lavish banquets and feasts that last for days, where the elite of Rome sit at his feet and listen to his increasingly erratic demands. During these lavish events, the emperor's behavior becomes more unpredictable and outlandish. The guests, surrounded by luxury and decadence, are often at the mercy of his whims. Caligula is rumoured to have forced senators to attend these banquets naked, further humiliating them and reminding them of their subjugation under his rule. Perhaps even more bizarrely, he takes pleasure in the degradation of others. He hosts cruel spectacles where the participants are treated like pawns in a twisted game for the emperor's amusement. Political enemies are often turned into human props in his grotesque performances. Those who fail to entertain him or meet his expectations quickly find themselves on the chopping block. Caligula's sexual exploits, too, become notorious. Historians have long debated the exact nature of his sexual behaviour, with rumours of incest, orgies, and general debauchery following him throughout his reign. His relationships with his sisters, particularly Julia Livilla, have been widely scrutinised. Ancient sources suggest that Caligula took great pleasure in shocking both the Senate and the people of Rome by making his personal affairs public. His sexual desires knew no limits, and his complete disregard for Roman norms and values only intensified his reputation as a depraved ruler. Though the truth of these accusations is debated among historians, there is no doubt that Caligula's personal indulgences, combined with his brutal treatment of others, painted a picture of a man who was both unpredictable and terrifying. The people of Rome, once hopeful under his reign, now feared him, whether they were in the Senate, among the political elite, or simply everyday citizens who once cheered his rise. But perhaps the most dangerous and telling aspect of Caligula's descent into madness was his complete belief in his own godhood. No longer content with just ruling Rome, Caligula began to see himself as a divine being. His arrogance grew to new extremes. He declared that he was a living god and demanded worship from the Roman people. Statues of Caligula were erected in temples dedicated to Jupiter, the king of the gods. He had temples built in his honour, and his subjects were forced to bow before him as though he were a god in human form. Caligula's ego and self-importance grew unchecked, leading to increasingly erratic demands for reverence. It wasn't enough for him to be powerful, he needed to be worshipped and adored. He became a tyrant in every sense of the word, insisting on complete and absolute loyalty from his subjects. But when he started demanding that even the Senate worship him as a god, the situation reached a breaking point. The Senate, once a body of power and respect, now found itself helpless against the emperor's whims. In his most outrageous act, Caligula made his favourite horse, Incitatus, a priest, and planned to make him a consul, one of the highest positions in the Roman government. While many view this as a deliberate mockery of the Senate, it's also an act of pure madness. The idea that Caligula could elevate a horse to such a position, while mocking the Roman political system, is symbolic of just how far his delusions had taken him. For Caligula, it wasn't just about power, it was about showing that no one, not even the Senate, could stand in his way. As the emperor's delusions of grandeur reached new heights, he began to make more bizarre and irrational decisions, ones that only fueled the fire of discontent among those who still hoped for some semblance of reason in his reign. His demand for divine worship, paired with his erratic behaviour, made him an increasingly unstable ruler, and one who had, in the eyes of many, gone completely mad. By AD 41, the empire that Caligula had once ruled with such hope and promise now teeters on the brink of collapse. What started as a reign of potential, one filled with promises of a new, brighter future for Rome, had devolved into a nightmarish era of terror, cruelty, and madness. His actions had alienated the Senate, his allies, and even his own family. As the emperor grew more erratic and delusional, it became increasingly clear that the only way to end the madness was through violent means. By now, Caligula's behaviour has alienated virtually everyone around him. The political elite is terrified, the Senate is powerless, and his family lives in constant fear. Even those who initially helped him rise to power now find themselves marked as enemies. Their loyalty to the emperor no longer enough to shield them from his growing paranoia. There are whispers of plots, both real and imagined, against his life. While Caligula's cruelty toward his enemies has been well documented, what is truly chilling is the extent of his paranoia. He believes that anyone, even those closest to him, might be conspiring against him. He becomes increasingly unpredictable, ordering executions based on little more than a rumor or a slight, no matter how insignificant. No one is safe, and the fear of betrayal hangs over the empire like a dark cloud. The emperor's increasing instability is also reflected in his bizarre decisions. He begins to display a complete disregard for the traditions and values that had once made Rome the greatest empire the world had ever known. Instead of ruling with reason, he rules with whim, indulging in every impulse and desire, no matter how perverse or self-destructive. It becomes clear that Caligula has abandoned the dignity of the office he holds and is now driven solely by a need to assert his absolute power over every aspect of life in Rome. But it isn't just his behavior that is the problem, it's his mindset. Caligula's belief in his divinity grows ever stronger. He now insists on being worshipped as a living god, demanding not just reverence but total submission. His self-obsession becomes total and all-consuming. For Caligula, ruling Rome is no longer enough. He must be adored as a divine figure. His demands for worship and obedience become more oppressive with each passing day, further isolating him from those who could have once been his allies. As the emperor's behavior grows more intolerable, the idea of a rebellion against him begins to take hold. The whispers of his madness and cruelty that have been circulating for years now coalesce into a conspiracy, a plot to rid Rome of its tyrant emperor. It is not just senators who are involved, but high-ranking military officers and even some of Caligula's own guards. They see the writing on the wall. The emperor has gone mad, and he is no longer fit to rule. His death is now seen as the only way to restore order to the empire. The conspirators include men who had once been loyal to Caligula, such as Cassius Chaerea, a senior officer in the Praetorian Guard. Chaerea is said to have been deeply offended by Caligula's cruel treatment of the guards, as well as the emperor's increasingly erratic behavior. He had long endured the emperor's insults and had finally decided that something had to be done. Alongside other members of the guard and a few disgruntled senators, they begin to plot Caligula's assassination. The conspiracy is carefully planned. Caligula's paranoia has led him to trust no one, but ironically, this provides the conspirators with a unique opportunity. The emperor's habit of isolating himself, coupled with his love of spectacle, creates an opening for those who seek to end his reign. On the day of the assassination, Caligula is attending a performance at the Palatine Games, a public event where he is unguarded and surrounded by an audience. He is unaware that the very people tasked with protecting him have turned against him. It is January 24th, Anno Domini 41. The plot is set in motion. As Caligula moves through the corridors of the theatre, he is ambushed by the conspirators. Cassius Chaerea and the others spring into action, attacking the emperor with knives and swords. The attack is swift and brutal, and Caligula, despite his elevated position and godlike status, is quickly overwhelmed. It's said that Caligula fought back in vain, but the odds are simply too much. As the emperor's bodyguard turns on him, the emperor falls, and his reign of terror comes to a violent end. His death marks the end of a short but horrifying chapter in Rome's history. But what does his death truly mean for the empire? For those who had lived under Caligula's cruelty, there is a sense of relief. The man who had terrorized Rome, who had demanded to be worshipped as a god, is gone. But his death does not immediately restore peace or order. The power vacuum left by Caligula's assassination sets off a new round of chaos, as various factions vie for control of the empire. In the wake of Caligula's assassination, Rome is left to pick up the pieces of its shattered political system. The conspirators, now fearing for their lives, quickly turn on each other, each hoping to secure their own position in the new power structure. There is no immediate heir to the throne, and the Senate, which has been rendered impotent by Caligula's reign, finds itself once again at the mercy of the Praetorian Guard and the military. In a bizarre twist of fate, Caligula's uncle, Claudius, who had been seen as a weak and unlikely ruler, is declared emperor. His ascension to the throne marks a dramatic shift in Rome's leadership, a shift that brings stability, but at the cost of a brutal and destructive reign. As for Caligula's legacy, it is sealed in infamy. His reign, filled with madness, terror, and self-aggrandizement, becomes a cautionary tale of the dangers of unchecked power. Rome, in its quest for a powerful ruler, had fallen victim to one of history's most despotic emperors. Caligula's story is not just one of a man who lost his mind. It is the story of an empire that, for a brief time, allowed absolute power to corrupt absolutely. His assassination marked the end of a tyrant's rule, but it also left a scar on the Roman Empire that would not fade easily. The death of Caligula on January 24th, AD 41, may have brought an end to one of the most infamous reigns in Roman history, but it did not signal the end of the chaos he had unleashed. The blood of the emperor is still fresh on the marble floors of the theatre, and Rome's streets are now filled with whispers and uncertainty. The conspirators who struck the blow may have freed the empire from a tyrant, but they now find themselves facing the difficult task of navigating the power vacuum that Caligula's death has left in its wake. For the citizens of Rome, there's a strange mix of relief and trepidation. Caligula's reign had been brutal, marked by violence, paranoia, and excess, but it was also a time of unprecedented imperial power. With his assassination, Rome's future is now uncertain. The Senate, disempowered during Caligula's madness, has no clear path forward, and the Praetorian Guard, the very force that killed Caligula, now holds a dangerous amount of power. In the immediate aftermath, the conspirators who assassinated Caligula are not celebrated as liberators. Their lives are still at risk, as the empire waits to see what will happen next. The political landscape of Rome is on the edge of a knife, and the question on everyone's mind is, who will rule now? The answer comes from the most unlikely of places, Caligula's uncle, Claudius. He had been viewed by many as weak and ineffective, a man who seemed destined to remain in the shadows of Roman politics. However, the death of Caligula, combined with the chaos of the moment, presents an opportunity for Claudius to seize power. Claudius was never meant to be emperor. He had been somewhat of a recluse, known more for his physical infirmities than his political acumen. His stammer, limp, and awkward appearance had made him an object of mockery among the elites. But as the Praetorian Guard, whose loyalty was instrumental in securing the throne, found themselves facing a power vacuum with no clear successor, they chose the only option that seemed safe, Claudius. His elevation to the throne was swift. In a move that stunned both the Senate and the people of Rome, Claudius is declared emperor. Despite his earlier reputation as a weakling, the Praetorian Guard now sees in him a figurehead who will be easy to control. But this underestimates Claudius's cunning, and the unexpected nature of his rise begins to take root. Once he assumes power, Claudius's first order of business is to stabilize the empire. His rule, though initially seen as a mere placeholder for the military power behind the throne, soon reveals itself as one of surprising pragmatism and stability. Claudius begins to rebuild Rome after the chaos of Caligula's reign, instituting legal reforms, expanding the empire, and restoring a sense of normalcy to the Roman world.
But while Claudius brings Rome a much-needed period of stability, his reign is marked by the memory of his predecessor's insanity. The scars of Caligula's rule run deep, and many of Rome's political elite and citizens are left grappling with the trauma of those dark years. Claudius, while not as extreme as Caligula, is seen by many as a figurehead of the military rather than an emperor with true imperial authority. His reign will ultimately be marked by the struggle between the Senate, the military, and the emperor for control of the empire. While Claudius works to rebuild the empire, Caligula's legacy is one of madness, cruelty, and fear. The memory of his reign will linger for generations. His actions, his delusions of godhood, his cruelty toward his family, and the bizarre indulgences he granted himself will be forever etched into the history of Rome. The assassination of Caligula is not merely seen as an act of political necessity. It becomes a symbol of Rome's vulnerability to the madness of unchecked power. In the years to come, his reign will be remembered as a cautionary tale of what happens when an emperor becomes a tyrant, consumed by his own ego. Caligula's name will be used as shorthand for cruelty, excess, and madness in the annals of Roman history. But despite the terror that Caligula unleashed, his death also signals the beginning of a new chapter for the Roman Empire. Claudius's reign will not be as chaotic or violent, but the empire will continue to grapple with the dangers of absolute power and the legacy of a ruler who took that power too far. One of the most significant consequences of Caligula's assassination is the continued influence of the Praetorian Guard. These elite soldiers, who had once protected the emperor, now find themselves as the power brokers of Rome. They are the ones who chose Claudius, and they hold the key to the stability of his rule. The Praetorian Guard, though not as openly tyrannical as Caligula, will continue to exert significant power in Roman politics. Their ability to decide who will become emperor becomes a permanent fixture of Roman imperial history. The Guard's loyalty to the emperor, or lack thereof, will continue to shape the course of the empire for centuries to come. Claudius, aware of the Praetorian Guard's power, makes an effort to keep them loyal. He grants them large sums of money, offers them rewards, and makes efforts to ensure that they remain on his side. This system of patronage helps to secure his reign, but it also sets the stage for future emperors to rely on the military to secure their thrones. The Praetorian Guard will continue to be a powerful political force, and in the years that follow, the Guard will play a crucial role in the rise and fall of emperors. The legacy of Caligula's assassination will echo in this military-driven politics for centuries, setting the stage for further instability and bloodshed in Rome's future. Caligula's reign was short, brutal, and filled with excess and terror, but its impact ripples through Roman history long after his death. While his assassination brought an end to one of the most erratic and destructive emperors in history, the consequences of his rule lingered in the very fabric of the empire. The political instability and the unchecked power of the emperor, exposed by Caligula's madness, would continue to haunt Rome for generations. Even the rise of Claudius, who brought a much-needed stability after the chaos, could not fully erase the scars left by Caligula's tyranny. With Caligula dead and Claudius unexpectedly taking the throne, Rome faces a strange paradox. On one hand, there's relief that the maniacal rule of the emperor god has ended. On the other, there's fear, uncertainty, and a dangerous power vacuum. The assassination left behind a fragmented and disillusioned empire, one where no one knew who could be trusted, and where political alliances were often determined by who controlled the military. Claudius, though considered an unlikely emperor, proves himself a stabilizing force in the short term. He works to restore order, rebuild the political system, and expand the empire. But the effects of Caligula's reign linger. The Senate, once a prestigious institution, remains weakened, having been decimated by Caligula's purges. It has become clear to everyone that the emperor's power in Rome has become almost absolute, and that no one, senator or commoner, is safe from the whims of the man on the throne. Despite Caligula's attempt to break the Senate's power and rule with unchecked authority, Claudius is careful not to make the same mistake. He knows he must balance power between the military and the Senate to avoid the chaos Caligula left behind. Claudius's reign will mark a significant shift in Rome's political culture, with a much stronger military influence, setting a precedent for future emperors. One of the most enduring legacies of Caligula's assassination is the role of the Praetorian Guard. It was the Guard who had killed Caligula, and it was their decision to elevate Claudius to the throne. This marks a turning point in Roman imperial politics. The Praetorian Guard now becomes the key power broker in Rome's imperial system. While the Guard's role in Caligula's downfall was seen as a necessary evil, its influence didn't stop there. The Guard will continue to have a significant role in determining who ascends to the throne, even beyond the reign of Claudius. In fact, the Praetorian Guard's involvement in the selection of future emperors will lead to several bloody power struggles, where the fate of the empire will often rest on the loyalty of a few thousand soldiers. This military-driven politics will continue to destabilize Rome in the years to come, setting the stage for even greater violence and intrigue. Claudius, aware of the Guard's power, works hard to keep them loyal to him. He rewards them handsomely with money, land, and positions of honor. His careful balancing act ensures that he can reign peacefully. But this dependence on the military marks a significant departure from the more traditional power structures of earlier emperors. Claudius's reign is often remembered for being one of relative stability compared to Caligula's madness, but it's also an era of pragmatic reforms. Where Caligula had ignored the traditions of Rome, Claudius was committed to restoring the old ways, albeit under the tight grip of imperial authority. He initiated public works, judicial reforms, and even extended citizenship to many people in the provinces. His rule was marked by an expansion of Roman territory, including the conquest of Britain in AD 43, a major military achievement that solidified his position. But even as Claudius works to rebuild what Caligula destroyed, the shadow of the former emperor's rule continues to hang over the empire. The memory of Caligula's erratic behavior and the terror he unleashed is not easily forgotten. Caligula may have been physically removed from the throne, but his reign left a permanent scar on the psyche of the Roman elite and its people. The idea that a single ruler could descend into madness and wield such power was a frightening reminder that absolute power was, in fact, too much to trust in one man. Caligula's name, long after his death, would be synonymous with tyranny, madness, and excess. Even in the centuries that followed, he would be remembered as one of the worst Roman emperors, perhaps even the most infamous. His story would be told and retold as a cautionary tale about the dangers of unchecked power and the madness that could result from absolute rule. His cult of personality, in which he demanded to be worshipped as a god, set the stage for future emperors to cultivate their own divine status. While Caligula was perhaps the most extreme example, his reign represented a dangerous precedent, one where the line between emperor and deity was dangerously blurred. This self-deification would not be lost on later rulers, who would continue to assert their own divinity, even as they struggled to maintain the grip on power Caligula had so recklessly squandered. The influence of Caligula's reign is also evident in how it affected the perception of imperial power. While future emperors, such as Nero and Domitian, would rise to power, many of them would find themselves grappling with the same fears and insecurities that Caligula had, often resorting to the same authoritarian tactics. The fear of losing power and becoming a target for conspiracies would continue to shape the psyche of Roman rulers long after Caligula's death. The story of Caligula serves as a turning point in Roman history. His reign marks the beginning of an era in which emperors would be seen as godlike figures, powerful, uncontrollable, and often above the law. The power of the Senate continues to weaken, the military's influence grows, and the imperial system becomes increasingly centralized in the hands of one man. Claudius, though less destructive than Caligula, is forced to navigate this new world of military influence and the growing cult of the emperor. His rule, while relatively peaceful, is the start of a more militarized Rome, where the loyalty of soldiers becomes more important than the approval of the Senate or the people. In the years following Caligula's assassination, the empire is forever changed. The legacy of the emperor who had proclaimed himself a god, lived in excess, and terrorized Rome, is one that cannot easily be erased. His reign may have ended violently, but his impact continues to shape the empire that follows. Caligula's story, full of excess and madness, will echo throughout Roman history as a symbol of the dangers of absolute power and the chaos that can follow when a ruler loses sight of their people, their senate, and their own sanity.